everybody. Thanks for joining me today. Karl Hughes here with Retained Trust. And today I've got a little bit different of an episode for you. I'm going to be doing a solo episode. And this is based on a lot of research I've been doing lately, as well as a blog post I wrote and a lot of the interviews that I've done on this podcast to date. So today I'm going to be talking about how to sell a digital marketing agency. And this question comes up a lot because, as you all who are longtime listeners know, I have both started and bought digital marketing agencies myself. So I'm experienced on the buy side. But one of the things I really wanted to dive into for the purposes of this video and the accompanying blog post that I have with it, we'll have linked in the show notes, is to see what it's like from the seller's side and to think about the things that you need to consider as a seller. What's interesting is most sellers only sell a business once in their lifetime. And so it's a huge event, life-changing event, literally. But at the same time, you don't get many chances to practice it or improve it or prepare for it. It's really hard to do well. And to be honest, the scariest bit is that 75% of people who sell their business regret it within a year. And so before we get into the tactics, what I want to do is just lay the scene here. As somebody who's owned their own agency for a long time, I know how easy it is to get wrapped up in the emotional connection that I've built with my businesses. And I'm sure almost all of you who are out there listening to this right now are thinking the same thing. I love this business. I could never sell it. But the truth is, we're all going to sell or exit some way, somehow, someday. Could be when you pass away, the business rolls over to whoever gets your stuff at the end of your life. Or it could be, hopefully, a little before that as a way for you to fund your own retirement or to pass on money to your kids. So without further ado, let's talk about how you can get ready and prepared to sell your digital marketing agency. The first thing you need to understand before you sell is how buyers value digital agencies. So what I mean by that is a digital agency isn't worth just some magical random number that gets picked out of the sky. They almost always have comps in some way. And comps are comparable asset sales that have been done in the past. These comps are going to be sort of what lays the groundwork for your digital agency sale price. Now, most of my experience on the buy side is buying digital agencies between 1 and 5 million in revenue. So a lot of what I'm going to say applies to digital agencies on that smaller end of the spectrum. I'll fully admit that for digital agencies doing 5, 10, 20, 30 million in top line revenue, 100 million in top line revenue, your multiples or your numbers you're going to look at are going to be higher, but the same fundamentals exist. So I'll go over it this way. If you own a digital agency between 1 and 5 million in top line revenue, that's total revenue that comes in through clients, you can likely expect to get somewhere between 2 and 4 times your SDE. So that's seller's discretionary earnings. Now, there's a lot of acronyms that get thrown out when you're getting ready to sell your business. So let me go over a few of those. There's EBITDA, which is EBITDA. So what that means is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization, which is a really fancy way of saying your profit minus or adding back any of your debt or taxes and things like that. So it's really your profit from a functional standpoint, but look into that acronym and know what that means. So a lot of people will throw around the word EBITDA. That's very common, especially for larger agencies, to get valued on EBITDA. A few larger agencies will get valued on revenue multiples, but this is rare. And so I would kind of negate this for the purposes of most people looking to sell their digital agency. Revenue multiples, probably not realistic, but it is possible that you could get a 1 to 2 times revenue offer for your agency. EBITDA multiples more common, and you're likely to get a 3 to 6 times multiple on EBITDA for your agency between that 1 and 5 million in revenue. Now, the reason it gets higher as you get bigger is that buyers see your agency as more likely to be self-sufficient and not reliant on the owner. So fundamentally, buyers want businesses that don't rely on the owner, right? And so a big part of that is the business has to be big enough to support a real management team that can actually run the business and strategically give insight into the industry, et cetera. So buyers and the most competitive buyers that want the biggest, best companies are going to want bigger agencies. Now, the last term that I already mentioned once is SDE, seller's discretionary earnings. Now, this is the way we value agencies when we buy them. And the reason for it is we're buying agencies that are small enough where the owner's income, what they're paying themselves, is a significant portion of the profits. So seller's discretionary earnings is essentially EBITDA plus what the seller pays themselves as a salary. And so seller's discretionary earnings is going to be profit plus your take-home pay that you pay yourself from the business. So likely on a business of, say, like $1 million in top-line revenue, A seller's discretionary earnings might be $250,000 a year. So in other words, you might make $1 million in top line revenue, you pay $750,000 in expenses, and then $250,000 comes to you as the owner, and then you pay taxes on that and anything else. Obviously, debt service goes in there somewhere, and we those really nitty-gritty specifics I won't get into. But that bottom line SDE number is what I want to look at as a buyer to understand how much this business is worth. And then I'm going to offer you as a seller somewhere between 2 and 4 times your SDE, depending on how turnkey that business is, for lack of a better word. So let's talk about what that means next. I mentioned that agencies typically sell for 2 to 4 times SDE, but what impacts that multiple? How do I get a 4x SDE multiple offer? Or maybe even higher, 5 or 6x? If you're a really great company, it's possible. So there's a few things that matter to buyers. And again, it's all going to come back to how autonomous is this business? How easy does it run without the existing owner? So in other words, the more involved you as an owner are in things like sales, the production and oversight of projects with clients, the marketing, the business development, the strategy, running payroll, all the little stuff you do as an owner is going to kind of ding your valuation essentially. And you'll end up with lower multiple offers if you've got more of that stuff on your plate and less of it on your teammates' plate. So there's a few factors you can think about as an owner to maximize your valuation. First one is that owner independence. I think this is super important. It's worth spending a lot of time documenting your processes and looking for people who can actually fill in the gaps and do the work for you so that you're not doing everything in your company. If you haven't read it, The E-Myth and The E-Myth Revisited is a great book to basically show you what is it like to build a business template and hand it off to other people. I think that's sort of foundational to selling your business, is getting it to where it runs without you. And as an agency owner, I would say that the number one priority is get production or client-facing processes working without you. If you can do that, at least you're going to get a lot better valuation than if everything is relying on you. The second priority is get sales off of your plate. Figure out how you can get the agency to actually close deals without you in the room. If you can do those two things, you're like 90% of the way there to making your agency autonomous and much more saleable. The next thing that matters for your valuation is going to be how much of that revenue is recurring or reoccurring. Basically, as a buyer, I'm going to use the cash flow for the business to either pay myself back for the investment I make or to pay back the debt that I get on buying that company. And so I really care about the quality of earnings, meaning how sticky is the revenue and the cash flow that I'm buying. So if every customer comes to you and works with you for 3 months and then churns and never comes back because it's a one-time project type business, say you're setting up single landing pages for small startups, and they only ever run these experiments once, and then they move on and get a bigger landing page from a real big company, super hard to sell that business because you need to constantly bring in new customers, and they're very short-run projects. On the other hand, if you run something like a content marketing agency and most of your clients are on ongoing retainers or year-long contracts and they almost always renew and you have a very low churn rate, it's going to be extremely valuable business. No matter what technology does to the business around content marketing, just the fact that clients are continually coming back gives buyers a lot of confidence that this is something that's going to be around. The next factor to think about is client concentration. And I see this a lot with little agencies that I'm buying, where somewhere around $1 million in revenue, but let's say 300,000 or 400,000 of that revenue is one single client. That's a super risky move for a buyer to come into, because what if that one client churns? As a buyer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to de-risk that acquisition by telling the seller, hey, I'm going to pay you a bunch of money, but a lot of that's going to be contingent on that big client sticking around for the next 2 or 3 years. And that's going to be your job to come in here and keep that big client happy. That kind of sucks because now you've sold your business, but you still have to keep working at it to keep that really big client happy. And you may not have control over all the same factors. So the important thing is to cut client concentration down. What we like to see as buyers is somewhere around no client having between 10 or 20% of your revenue. If it gets more than that, it's a red flag, and we're going to start to ding the valuation. The last thing I'll mention here that matters in affecting your multiple is your margins and your growth rate. So margins are how much profit flows through every dollar of revenue. So let's say that $1 million top line business, we do $1 million in revenue and it's $250K in SDE. That's a pretty good margin, but $1 million in revenue and $500K SDE is even better. And so as a buyer, I want to look for businesses that are typically going to be between 20 and 50% net margins. A lot of times that when they're in that higher range, it's because the owner is paying themselves a lot and doing a lot. So again, I'm going to look at owner independence and I'm going to factor those two things against each other to make sure I'm giving you a fair offer and also realistic offer based on what the business will do once you exit. The other part of this that I just mentioned is the growth rate. So in other words, if your business has been stagnant and flat for the last 5 years, A, it's good that it's at least predictable that it's going to continue to probably be about that same level of revenue in the next 5 years. But that said, we like to see a growth rate. I'd like to see it going up by 10% a year because that shows me that there's more clients coming in. You're taking opportunities to upsell people and it's working. And that shows that the business has a little more stability and a little more growth opportunity than one that's kind of flat. There's also businesses I've seen where they're growing so fast that it seems likely impossible to continue. And I think this is where it gets into a bit of a depends on your buyer situation. I prefer businesses that are a little more flat in that they have a predictable revenue rather than one that's gone up a lot and then down a lot, then up a lot. That spikiness is a little scary for me as a buyer. But at the same time, looking at your growth rate and knowing your growth rate over years, knowing your margins, super important part of this, and every buyer is going to ask you those things. Okay, so once you've got your foundational financials in place as a seller, you want to start to look at where we could go to find buyers. Now, ideally, you start this process years before you actually go to market. What I mean is, before you actually go to sell your business, get to know who buys your type of digital marketing agency. In other words, is it just going to be other larger competitors, or are you big enough that private equity might scoop you up in a big roll-up? Or is it so small that only individual buyers are going to be interested? We're pretty unique at Retain Trust and the holdco that we've built in that we're buying $1 to $5 million agencies. That's a pretty tough spot to sell in because private equity usually doesn't come in until 10 or 15 million in revenue. So you really want to know your market and know the places that you can go to sell your business. Even if you're 2 or 3 years out from selling, it never hurts to start talking to people about the potential and whether they might be interested in at least having partnership conversations. One thing I've done consistently since I started my first agency is build relationships with the 5 or 10 closest competitors. So at least we know each other exists. I know at the end of the day, someday I'm going to sell, someday they're going to sell. I want to be in that conversation when that happens. There are lots of places to go if you don't know where to start when it comes to selling your business. There's marketplaces like Rejig, BizBuySell, website closers. I think these are all fine, at least to go around and look for listings that are similar to yours so you get some idea of the comps that might be out there. There's also brokers. Now, brokers are going to be the kind of people you go to when you're ready to move. And I think even if you've done your pre-work and you've got a list of competitors, you've got a list of people that might be likely buyers, it never hurts to have conversation with brokers and at least understand if they work with agencies of your size and type and what kind of buyers and stories they have to sort of share their successes. Some brokers are general purpose, meaning they'll take any business in their size range. Other brokers are very specifically focused on agencies. It's obviously better if you get a more focused broker, but they might be more expensive because they're more specialized. So it depends. Do your homework. When it comes to building relationships with competitors, it's actually pretty straightforward, and a lot of people don't do it as well as they should. So the way I've done this is basically build a list of my 5 or 10 biggest competitors, and then I have annual touch points with them where I just try to get on a call with them or at least get in an email exchange and just see what's up, what they're seeing in the market, tell them about something I'm learning lately, share a little bit of info that's really not going to hurt either of us competitively, but is interesting to know across the board. I'll also look at what they're doing on the marketing side of things, what their founders are talking about on LinkedIn and see maybe they're giving some hints as to they're looking to buy a company or they just bought something. And that's good to know that they're in acquisition mode or not. Whether you're going to sell in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, you still want to have some feelers out to your competitors because they're often the best places to go for the best valuations. It's just tricky because you're trying not to give away too much information or let them know that you're looking to exit. Next, we've got private equity buyers. Now, if your agency is over 5 or 10 million in revenue, it starts to get interesting to private equity buyers. Basically, the way private equity works is a bunch of investors pool their money and then give it out to a fund in order to go buy a bunch of small companies, usually with the intent of rolling them up and getting what they call multiple arbitrage. Meaning, if you buy 10 $1 million companies, that company is theoretically now worth $10 million, but it gets a higher multiple because it's more revenue. In practice, it's a lot more complicated than that, and it doesn't always work. But that said, private equity can be a really interesting exit opportunity because they can often pay a higher multiple than some of the other buyers might be out there, especially individuals. And last, but again, a good option for smaller agencies that don't have many other exit opportunities are individual buyers. What this typically means is you look for somebody who just graduated from business school or somebody who's got one small agency and they want to buy a second, basically kind of buyer like me. And you go to them and you show them your books and they're going to be able to give you an offer based on how much debt they'd have to take to buy this company and then use the cash flow to pay that debt. Sometimes they'll offer part of it to be seller financed, meaning you as the seller will be getting paid over the course of months or years. Other times it might be all cash, but in a couple installments. It really just depends. There's a ton of variety in these deals, but for digital agencies doing 1 to 5 million in revenue or even smaller, this is kind of the only option at this point. So you want to find somebody on the buy side who is experienced and can take care of your business. And most of all, you really want to trust that individual. One thing I found in doing the last couple acquisitions we've done is that trust with the seller is extremely important, even if everything goes well, which in our case so far, knock on wood, it has. But that said, you still want to be able to go reach out to those people and talk about the clients you have and the little nuances that might have come up along the way. It's super important that you trust your buyer. And this probably applies to all stages. I just have the most experience here on the individual buyer side. Next, I want to talk about possible deal structures for buying digital agencies. So when you're looking to go to market, you want to think about what are your priorities in selling this business. Do you want to be out in 6 months no matter what? Are you okay sticking around longer if it means a total price paid to you over time? Do you want to get all your cash at closing, but get a smaller amount? Or would you be okay being paid over 5 years, but getting much more in total? All these things are possible, but it's super important that you, as the seller, understand the trade-offs and know what you're really looking for. Now, some sellers I talk to, they have no preference. They're kind of like, I just want to see what's out there and get a feel for it. That's fine at first. But the more you know about what you really want out of this deal, the easier it's going to be for a buyer to say, yes, this is something we can actually close on realistically, or no, we can't. So it's going to allow you to stop wasting time on buyers that really aren't a good fit for you. A few options that you might run into. First of all, there's cash at close. That means the day you sign the papers, a big bunch of money is going to hit your bank account. Almost always in a good, profitable digital agency, you should get some cash at close, and you should be pretty happy with that amount of money because at the end of the day, that's kind of the only thing that's guaranteed. Often, cash payments will be drug out after 2 or 3 installments. So you might get the first cash at close installment at month 1, month 0, essentially, day 0. And then you might get the next one 6 months in, and the next one 6 months after that. It's fine if you get this in installments, but just know the further it goes, the more possible it is that your buyer could tank the company and not be able to make those installments. And then you have to decide, is going to court worth it over this? Do they have anything to get money from anyway? Really tough decisions could have to be made. I've talked to plenty of people who sold their business and took a very small amount of cash at close and ended up really getting a bad deal because the buyer bought the business and didn't do a good job maintaining it. The next thing you'll see a lot is earnouts, where basically you as an owner are tasked with staying around at the company for 1 to 3 years to earn out the rest of your payments. So what this means is on day 1, you might get $100,000, and then they're going to pay you $200,000 a year for every year that you get at least $2 million in revenue. Again, these numbers are all made up, but that's the idea of an earnout, is to basically tie it to something that you're going to be helping drive. The problem is you don't have full control over the business anymore. So keep in mind when your earnout numbers and your earnout negotiation is happening, you may not be able to control revenue if the company that bought you is going to be in charge of the marketing budget, or you may not be able to control net profit if they're in charge of the operational costs for the business. So it's super important that you keep in mind an earnout is not guaranteed, and it's very likely that you and the seller will be or buyer will be at odds when it comes to who gets what in the earnout. The next option is seller financing. Similar to an earnout, this means you're not getting all your money right up front, but seller financing is a little different. It's a debt note that basically says, as the buyer, I'm going to pay you out this amount of money over this amount of time. The good thing about that is it's pretty much guaranteed. Unless there's any kind of forgivable clauses in the note itself, you are going to get that money if the buyer keeps the business running and has the cash flow to pay you. So if you're pretty confident the buyer is good and they're going to be around, seller financing is a good way to get paid over time. And often, as a buyer, I'm going to offer more total cash if the seller allows me to pay over 5 years than if they made me pay it all within 1 year. The last option you might see, especially in private equity deals, is an equity rollover. What this means is I come in as the buyer and I say, I'm going to offer you $1 million for 51% of your company, but not all of it. And I'm going to let you get out within a year. You're going to keep 49% of it, or whatever the number it is that the buyer's established. And that's going to be equity that you can roll over and continue to hold in the business, either to continue to get cash flows from the business, distributions, or as a way for you to get what they call a second bite at the apple, meaning this buyer is going to roll these companies up and then try to sell them again. And at that second sale, you're going to get even more money than you would have if they had just paid you all out at once. This is a good option if you really have faith that the new buyer is going to take care of your business and grow it. The last thing I'll talk about when it comes to selling your business is the closing process. So a lot of sellers don't really understand what all is involved in a typical sale of a small business. And so let's walk through the process as a whole, at a high level at least. And so you start to get your mind wrapped around what this looks like. The first step is a letter of intent. This is basically a formalized offer that a buyer will send to you in the form of a legal contract. That contract is non-binding though, typically. So what that means is I'm going to send you a contract that says, based on what we've discussed and what we've gone back and forth on emails and phone calls over the last, say month or so, I'm willing to offer you $2 million for your business, pending due diligence and final verification of all the documentation. But this is non-binding, meaning we can both break it off at any time. But it might also offer me, as the buyer, a period of exclusivity with you, meaning that you can't go continue to shop it around to other buyers. This is very common. Almost always it works this way. And when you sign that LOI, you should be pretty confident this is the buyer you want to work with, or at least get to know better, but it does not lock you into a sale. So don't get yourself too set on this has got to be the one I sell to. Some buyers will come in with really high numbers and sort of offers on their LOI and then try to resell or retrade it down. So in other words, they'll undercut that value later based on what they find in diligence. Others do that maliciously. Some do it honestly. It's really a tricky thing. And so don't take whatever the buyer offers you in that LOI as your final price. It's likely going to change before you get to the actual sale date. Once the LOI is signed, we enter a phase of due diligence. This is where both parties are getting to know each other better, and the buyer especially is spending a lot of time digging into the specifics of your business. They're going to look at your books. They're going to look at your bank statements. They're going to look at your credit card statements. They're going to look at all your employee payrolls, look at all the invoices you've sent with all the clients you've had. And it's going to be a pretty deep dive into your financial details, like it or not. So be ready for anything and everything to be on the table, including your personal tax returns. Due diligence can be pretty annoying because it's a lot of digging through paperwork and sort of fine detail work, but it's super important because buyers want to know that what you're telling them is true and they want to be able to back it all up. Finally, buyers are doing this partly because their investors or debt sources, so banks, are typically making them go through this. So don't take it too personally when they ask you for things that over and over again. Often it's just part of the process, but be ready to open up everything and share everything you can in the most transparency, because the more that buyer feels that you're giving them the whole truth, the more likely they are to stick with their original offer. Now, during diligence, they may be starting to tell you things that are taking down your initial offer. So, for example, they might find that, yeah, you booked $1.5 million in revenue, but 300,000 of that was to a client that is doing kind of work we're never going to do again. So we're going to sort of retrade that down. We're just going to discount that revenue and say it's not as valuable, and we'll pull your multiple down a little bit because of it. Very common. This kind of thing happens all the time. You can decide to negotiate it, or you can decide to pull out, or you can decide to keep going with it and see what happens. The actual purchase of your business is likely to be done as an asset purchase. Most agencies sell that way. And what that means is the buyer is going to put together a final purchase agreement that's going to say, we're going to pay you this much money for these particular assets of your business. Meaning they're not buying the actual name or LLC, the container for your business. They're going to buy all the pieces of it from within the business, usually contracts, employment records, goodwill, and a bunch of other intangibles, as well as possibly some tangible assets, especially if you have a real physical location and hardware and things like that. This is the stage where if you haven't had a lawyer review things up till now, you really need to have a lawyer review things. Now, I'll say a quick aside, I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice, but you should have legal counsel involved from the whole beginning of this process and on. In fact, you should build a relationship with a lawyer long before you start the acquisition process or finding buyers, just so somebody knows your business and has enough context around what you want. Look for a lawyer who's experienced in M&A, small business M&A, but also know your limits. In other words, if a lawyer's $2,000 an hour, it's probably not a good fit for a tiny business. You're just going to spend too much money for it to be worth it. But at the same time, you're going to have to spend some money. So be ready to spend a few $1,000s on legal reviews at both the LOI stage as well as the final close stage, and possibly along the way as the buyer's asking for diligence. Once the sale is closed, your work is probably not completely done. Likely, you're going to have several things to hand off to the new buyer. And in almost all cases, you're going to have an employment contract that comes along with this acquisition. What that means is you're probably going to go work for the buyer for 6, 12, 24, or even 36 months. I've seen contracts where the seller had to stay around for 5 years to get their full payout. It's not ideal, but it does happen a lot in agencies, especially ones that have high client concentration or high owner dependency. So I've walked you through the whole process of selling a digital agency, but what are some of the common mistakes that sellers make when they're going to market or before they're going to market? The first one is not understanding how valuations work or the process. So look, I get that you worked hard on your business and you've built it for 10 years and you think it should be worth something. But if the numbers aren't there, the financials aren't there, buyers don't care. It's not really an emotional game for business buyers. What we're looking at is hard data to tell us, is this business going to continue the cash flows it's had for the last several years when this owner exits? So don't get married to the idea that you know this business is worth $10 million because you believe it's worth $10 million. Do your diligence and actually think about, how would a buyer value this agency? What numbers would they want to see in order to produce predictable cash flows in the future? And how do I get those numbers to be better? The second thing a lot of sellers don't do is go find multiple offers. I think this is really a shame because at the end of the day, I might be a great guy and a good buyer, but I'm only one. I think you should have multiple data points telling you if this is the right valuation. Because I might say you should trade at a 2x multiple of your SDE, but there's a guy down the street who might offer you 3x, and there's somebody across the world who might offer you 4x. You should go out there and court multiple offers. Try to find comps that allow you to sort of leverage some of your knowledge about the industry to get a higher valuation. And look, at the end of the day, I know that means as a buyer, I might have to pay more, but I want you to be educated as a seller. And I want you to come out of this in a year and say, I did the right thing. The next thing a lot of sellers don't understand is the post-acquisition responsibilities and expectations that they're going to have. So read all your documents very carefully and get really firm commitments from your buyer as to how much they're going to involve you or need you in the coming months and years after the acquisition. If you have a heavy earnout, understand all the levers that could move in order to affect that earnout. If it's tied to net profit, how much control are you really going to have over the operating costs? If it's tied to total top line margin, how much control do you have over the sales team and the marketing team and the spend that you can have on ads? Make sure all that stuff makes sense to you and it all aligns so that your incentives are driving the same direction as your buyers. Finally, for many entrepreneurs, the feelings of regret that come after selling their business is because they didn't know what they wanted to do next. And let's think about it. The kind of people who start small businesses like we're doing today, that start multi-million-dollar agencies, are not the kind of people who can sit on the beach for 30 years. We need something to focus our energies on. A lot of sellers go into this thinking, if I just sell my business, I'll have the free time and money to just go figure out what I want next. But honestly, it's way harder to come up with ideas when you're in a vacuum like that than when you're actually running a business that keeps you moving day to day. So whatever it is you want to do next, write a book, go fly around the world, go meet people and write stories about it, or maybe do music. I don't know. It could be something totally different than you've done previously. Whatever it is, know what that plan is and know that it's going to take you 1 to 5 years to actually go through and do it so that you've got a big enough goal to keep you motivated post-sale. Otherwise, it's a surefire way to set yourself up for heartbreak. You're going to sell your business. You're going to say, what is the point of this? I didn't know what I was going to do next. And now I'm stuck here with a little bit of money and not nearly as much fulfillment as I had before. So be ready to come into the conversation of selling your business with what your exit plan is. It also makes me as a buyer more confident that you're really going to go through the whole process when you've got something lined up to do next. Finally, if you haven't read it, John Warrell's book called Built to Sell, one of the best ways to sort of evaluate your business and look through all the things that sellers or buyers rather are going to want to see before they acquire your business. He's got a great podcast as well. And if you like this sort of content, please feel free to check out my blog and continue listening to Retain Trust. We do episodes like this every single week. And most of the time, they're interviews with experienced agency owners who have grown, built, sold, and exited their businesses for many millions of dollars. So hopefully this is helpful. Follow along, hit subscribe on YouTube. Thanks for your time, everybody. Thank you for watching this episode of Retain Trust. If you like this one, give it a thumbs up and subscribe on YouTube. It takes 2 seconds and it helps others find out about the show. And if you have questions or suggestions for a future episode, leave a comment. See you next time.